Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. Two things. First, thank you for listening. And second, happy Independence Day.
I agree. You know, I try to, in preparing for this program, we do an annual 4th of July program. We do an annual Jefferson's birthday program. We do an annual January 1st program and a Christmas program and a Thanksgiving program.
Unless we forget.
But we
always do the 4th.
But I was thinking, well, what should we talk about this week? How do you talk about this? Well, of course, the story of how he came to write it is just such a great story, partly because of John Adams. But I've been thinking about this, and I know that, you and I agree on one thing, and that is that this is the 4th of July somehow has to be reflective at some level, at least briefly. It's that important.
If Jefferson had to pick one and one only holiday, that would be it.
Because I think, I've seen this, at Monticello and other places, they have the naturalization ceremony on the 4th of July. It's unbelievably moving because these are people from Iraq and Pakistan and Ukraine and Korea and Argentina and Chile. And they come here and they want to be Americans and they have to learn to be Americans. And it's not a simple exam. Most naturalized Americans would struggle with it. And then when they become citizens, you can see how deeply proud they are of that moment. I think every young American should be required for high school graduation to take the naturalization test.
I should probably do that for everybody. It's a great, fun conversation with Mr. Jefferson this week. But if I may interject, what you all need to do is get to the end of the program and listen to Clay's essay this week.
Aren't you excited?
I'm jealous. I just absolutely, it's great. Good for you.
Well, for me, the Jack Kerouac's On the Road got to me early. Yeah. But I'm doing this, and
this is why people retire.
I'm going to report back. I'm not retiring. I'm going out. This is a working holiday. I'm going out to take a look at America in the summer of 2019, and I'm going to do what John Steinbeck did. I'm going to go into a pub. And I don't do this usually. I don't talk. I just sit there and read.
Uh-huh.
I'm going to go in and I'm going to strike up conversations. I'm going to say, how are we doing? What do you think? What does this country need?
Get a lot of batteries for that recorder of yours, okay?
I'm going to listen to the voice, the Vox Populi. When I get out in the countryside to actual towns, villages, I invariably cheer up about this country.
Yeah.
Because the people in those towns are like America's last real patriots. And their lives are rooted, and they're neighborly, and they're funny, and they're unpretentious, and they have stories to tell, and they believe in this country so much, David. They're not disillusioned. They might be concerned, but they believe in the idea of America. And so I want to go out and hear that. I want to go to Devil's Tower, and I want to go to I won't get to the Grand Canyon, but I am going to the source of the mighty and heretofore deemed endless Colorado River.
Before we go to the show, do you want to talk about any of the upcoming cultural tours?
Yes. So France still has a few places, so do come. And actually, there are still 2 places for the summer Lewis and Clark trip, July 20 through 29th. If you want to ever come on the Lewis and Clark trip, now is the time. Go to jeffersonhour.com/tours. But then there's the France trip in October, the 20th through the 29th of October. I can't wait. And then finally, the 2 usual winter encampments at Locksaw Lodge west of Missoula. One is on the space program, the American space program. I was a space junkie all my life.
Still are.
And still am. And the other one is on Charles Dickens, 4 novels by Dickens. And then we're trying to go to Cuba in February.
Yeah.
Think
see
of
how that works out.
Yeah, you should come.
Yeah, let's end on a happy 4th of July note and your cultural tours, and you're all going to love his essay.
This whimsical
this week.
Journey I'm going to take.
And the last thing I will say is, if you can support the Thomas Jefferson Hour, please do so. We so appreciate it. Go to jeffersonhour.com and click on donate. You can join the 1776 Club, which will unlock all sorts of old episodes. And the coffee cups are coming. And so with that.
Happy 4th of July. I can say this with unambiguous pride. I love the United States of America, and I'm thrilled to be an American citizen.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay Jenkinson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and seated across from me is Mr. Thomas Jefferson. Sir, would you join me in wishing everyone a happy 4th of July, sir.
Indeed, it's the most important of American days. That was the day in July of 1776 when we issued a statement to the world that we were a free and sovereign people, that we had taken the abuse as long as we possibly could. We had shown preternatural patience in the face of the abuses of George III and his ministry in the Parliament of England, and now they had pressed us so far that we had no choice but to stand up and declare our own independence and sovereignty. That is not only the birth date of the United States of America, but it is also, in my opinion, the pivotal date in human history, not because I had anything to do with it. It would have been that with or without my penmanship, but it spells the moment when human beings took back their natural and ancient liberties and declared that they would no longer be tyrannized by George III or anyone else.
We received a question from a gentleman in Joplin, Missouri, sir, Mr. Paul Mulick. He is annoyed to no end, as he puts it, that almost no one refers to this holiday by its proper name. Nearly everyone calls it the 4th of July, as if that were the name of the holiday, and he says that its proper name is Independence Day. What was it during your time, sir?
We called it the Day of National Independence. That's certainly the case. It happened to have been on the 4th of July, and in the rest of my lifetime, the 4th of July became a public holiday in places all over the United States. There were fireworks and parades and speeches and barbecues and the drinking of ale and beer and the kind of fist fights and other things that happen on such occasions. This was from the beginning the character and nature of our National Independence Day. There's a boisterousness about being free, and there's nothing particularly wrong with all of that. But I don't think that there's any particular reason to get upset about what people call it, as long as you understand, in saying that it's the 4th of July, that it's not simply a time for misrule and hedonism, that the 4th of July should also be understood as a critically important moment in the history of the human project and the establishing moment of the system that we all enjoy in the United States.
I understand Mr. Mulick's question, and I understand his point. It is too easy for us to just think of it as a day of celebration, a holiday, and forget what Independence Day means. So I take his point.
Let me remind you of the last sentence of the Declaration of Independence. For the support of this declaration, with the firm reliance on the protections of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. In other words, this was not just a news release. We were pledging ourselves to see the revolution through, and we knew that before we were independent, which we assumed would happen, but we might have been defeated. We came close on several occasions to being defeated. But before we realized independence, we knew that our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor were in jeopardy. And this is true of me. Not that my life is particularly important, but I was almost captured by Bannister Tarleton and his dragoons at Monticello in the early summer of 1781. My fortune was destroyed. They didn't damage Monticello much, although they took some of its wine. But when they went to several of my other plantations, they burned down the barns and the tobacco. They either took or slaughtered the horses. They confiscated whatever slaves they found there. They did as much vandalism and physical damage as they possibly could. And I, in some respects, never fully recovered from the economic blows that came with the attacks on Virginia during the latter part of the Revolutionary War. And not to call attention to myself, but I paid off pressing debts during that period to British factors and British lenders. And after the settlement of the war in 1783, those debts were legally repudiated. So I had to pay again for debts that I had already paid off in the course of the war. And then finally, sacred honor. I suppose my honor has grown over time, but nobody knew at the time that I had written the Declaration of Independence. And then when I became the wartime governor of Virginia, things went so badly in my Commonwealth and for me that when I left office in June of 1781, it was in disarray, and there was widespread discontentment with my management of those affairs. And in fact, I was formally investigated by the Virginia House of Delegates for malfeasance in office.
A sad time, sure. Let's not go into that any
My point
farther.
is that the Declaration of Independence and the 4th of July may be a time of bratwurst and fireworks, but they were a time that tried men's souls and destroyed people's lives in my era.
Let's start at the beginning of that. Could you share with people how it was that you came to write the Declaration?
I was known, even though I was only 33 years old at the time, as an articulate penman, that I had a smooth and fluent prose style, that I didn't use two words where one would serve, that there was a great lucidity and clarity in my prose. And secondly, I was known to be a scholar of the history of government, a scholar of the history of liberty. And so I'd done all the hard reading. There was, up till that time, from the age of about 14 until my late 20s, I was reading 10, 12, sometimes 15 hours per day. It is probably the case that none of the other founding fathers was as deeply read in this tradition as I was, with the possible exception of my friend from Massachusetts, John Adams. I was 33 years old. I was the youngest member of the Virginia delegation. In fact, I was an alternate, but for the accidents of some other delegate going back to Virginia, I might not have had any hand in this business. My mother had died at the end of March 1776. I had lingered, therefore, in Virginia, and so I got back really just in time to receive this assignment, and it came to me, as I say, because of my reputation as a scholar who could write good English.
So you were recruited to do this, and where did you actually write the Declaration?
A committee of 5 was named by the Continental Congress. It included 3 of us who were central to the business, Dr. Franklin, John Adams, and myself. We talked about how we should go about this, and Franklin urged me to make a first draft. I, of course, wanted to defer to him. He was an infinitely more important human being and statesman than I was, but he was elderly and his health was not great, and he wanted younger hands to be central to this. And so I was staying in a boarding house on Market Street, living as a boarder. And one day, after Congress had created our committee, John Adams came to visit me. It was a very important moment in my life. And Adams, I served him tea, and we sat and began to talk. And he said, "Mr. Jefferson, you must write this declaration." And so I asked him why, thinking that he was a better candidate for this. He was much more important than I was in the build-up to the Revolution. I had played a really minor role. He had played a central and amazing role, and so I would certainly have deferred to him. He was 8 years my senior, and I was a non-entity compared to him in the halls of the Continental Congress. But he said, "You must write this declaration," and I asked why. He said 3 reasons. Number 1, you are a Virginian, and a Virginian must be at the head of this business. And he said that because there was a danger that the Revolution would be seen as a tax rebellion in Massachusetts, that local hotheads in the Boston area were the whole Revolution. And really then that would defeat its purpose. He wanted to show that it was a continental movement, not a local tax rebellion. And so he had helped to name George Washington as the commander-in-chief of the armies, even though I think it could be said there were abler people who might have taken on that role, but Washington was a Virginian. And now he wanted me as a Virginian to write this document because it would help to embrace a greater population base and a greater geography. It would nationalize the revolutionary movement. And he said, "Number 2, I, John Adams, am disliked and obnoxious, and if I write this document, I'll be the issue." And he was actually right that to be as effective as he had spoken constantly. He was prickly, outspoken, often aggressive, perceived as vain, sort of disposed to hold forth for long periods of time. And even though people understood that he was a great man and essential to the revolution, they were a little tired of him. And so he thought that if he wrote it, it would be controversial because he wrote it. And that if I wrote it as a comparative nonentity, that there would be no ad hominem view of the thing. And so that was his second reason. Then he said, third, you write 10 times better than I do, which I don't know about 10 times, but it's true that Adams had a very Ciceronian, complex, subordinate style of semicolons and syllogistic logic and quarrels with his enemies and a kind of a metaphysical vocabulary and a kind of legal abstraction and jargon. And so if he had written the Declaration of Independence, I think it is actually fair to say it would have been less compelling than the version that I wrote. And so on the basis of that a Virginian must be at the head of this business, that I was a more likely candidate to see this through than Adams, and that I wrote better than he did, I reluctantly agreed to make a run at it. And I wrote the first draft in a single day. I looked at it and made a few changes, handed it in to Franklin and Adams. They made a couple of very felicitous suggestions, and on the 28th of June, 1776, the three of us handed it in to the Second Continental Congress for its consideration.
And I hesitate to bring it up, but that led to sort of a painful day for you. I don't know if you wish to talk about that or not, sir.
I can. All I can say is that on the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th of July, 1776, the Continental Congress debated my draft. Every paragraph, every concept, every point of punctuation, every bit of diction, the logic, the rhetoric, the list of indictments that I made against George III. It was a very painful thing.
We need to take a short break. No true writer likes to be edited.
Perhaps I can regroup.
We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, and a happy Independence Day, 4th of July, to everyone. We're talking with President Jefferson this week, and when we took our break, sir, we were talking about your writing of the actual document, and I apologize for bringing up some painful memories. Did you have anything further you wanted to say about that, sir?
Well, just that as a member of the Virginia delegation, I had to sit there and listen to the debate. And as a gentleman, I could not really argue for my own language, my own draft. That would not be decorous. Besides, I was very shy, exceedingly shy. But secondly, as a gentleman, I couldn't really leave the room either, which I would very much have wanted to do, because I was there in an impotent capacity of watching but not being able to in any way guide the deliberations. And so this was one of the most painful things that I can remember. And Franklin had said when he was offered the chance to write it that he would never again write anything subject to committee review. And my goodness, I learned the wisdom of that, because there I was, and as they talked about it, I squirmed and writhed and agonized and wished that I were anywhere else on earth, and particularly back with my wife in Virginia. Her health was very much in jeopardy at the time, but Franklin saw this, and of course Franklin was the most amiable and genial of all human beings, and he told me this story, which I won't go into details about, but it was about a sign project that a hatter by a certain name wanted to have a sign to advertise to the people of his town that he made and sold hats. And so he proposed a draft language and an illustration of a hat. And, of course, each of his neighbors came and said, well, that's redundant. You don't need to do that. Everyone knows it's hats. And in the original language, he said he sells hats for ready money. And someone said, well, of course it's ready money. What do you think? You're going to give people credit? And on and on and on. Everyone quibbled with this until in the end, he just had a picture of a hat. And that was Franklin's way of saying, there are a lot of busybodies in this world, and everyone thinks they know more. But he also was saying that this process, however disagreeable it is, does whittle down things to their essence. And that I think he was saying that if you could only get out from under your own diffidence, Mr. Jefferson, you might see that this process, however unpleasant, will actually make this, at least arguably, a better document.
There is a vision that Americans have, sir, of you sitting in that boarding house on Market Street in Philadelphia, and you had sort of a unique portable writing desk that you used to write the Declaration of Independence.
I designed it. I designed the desk.
Later in life, you acknowledged that this might be something important in American history, and sure, it has become important. I must tell you that it is housed in a very large museum in Washington, D.C., and I have seen it, and I think it's fair to say that it's difficult to be an American and see that desk and not have your heart flutter a bit, sir.
Well, I hope you like the design.
I did.
I designed it myself and had it built by a craftsman, and it is on that desk that I wrote the Declaration of Independence. I later gave it to a granddaughter. I had given her another desk. That desk had miscarried in her transit to another city. And I sent it to her with a wry note, which perhaps you can unearth and make available to our listeners. But it basically said, in a kind of self-depreciating way, you know how people are about relics, and this one probably does wind up being an American relic.
I happen to have that letter
what
in front
does
of
it
me.
say, sir?
It was written to Ellen Randolph Coolidge.
My favorite granddaughter.
Ah, I see. And you write that I happen to still possess the writing box on which it was written, and Mr. Coolidge must do me the favor of accepting this.
Her husband.
Its imaginary value will increase with the years, and if he lives to my age or another half-century, he may see it carried in the procession of our nation's birthday as the relics of the saints are in those of the church.
Now that's humor.
Of course.
There's a wryness there.
And a bit of truth as well, sir.
Let me talk about this for a moment, if I may. The one question is, did we know what we were about? Did we know that we were doing something of world historical importance? And the answer is yes. We didn't know that we would succeed. Things could easily have gone badly for us. I might have been arrested during that raid on Monticello. The British might have won the war, and if that were the case, they certainly would have punished the ringleaders, and I might have been considered in the second or third tier of such people. But more than that, we had a sense that the history of humankind was coming to a pivot here, and that however imperfect we were, we embodied the hopes of humankind, that for most of human history, people have been treated like rubbish. Their rulers have trampled upon them, confiscated their estates, imposed their personal religious prejudices on people, consumed their estates by way of inordinate and unfair taxes. In some cases in Britain, aristocrats had chosen to sleep with the daughters of their tenants. And this was even enshrined in a certain type of feudal law. That for most of human history, most humans have been treated as cattle, and the aristocrats and the kings have pretended that they are divinely sanctioned and that God intended them to lord it over the rest of us. And life for most people in most of human history has been miserable, and that's why in medieval Christianity, there was the notion that we were born broken. Thanks to original sin, we live in a vale of tears, that our lives are misery, and that we can only hope that we graduate into heaven at the end of it. And so that's sort of the standard way that life was. Nasty, brutish, and short, said Thomas Hobbes, for most of the history of humanity. And suddenly, thanks to the Renaissance and the scientific revolution, and particularly the Enlightenment, humans suddenly had a sense that they were born with rights and that a king is just a person. He's not chosen by God. He's there by a series of social accidents. And he's no better than an average person, or he certainly is not inevitably better than an average person. And these class distinctions have been created by people of privilege to maintain their control of the economy and their control of everybody else. And so, in a sense, with the Renaissance, but particularly the Enlightenment, man woke up finally. And when he woke up, he was in a bad mood. In the French Revolution, lots of blood was shed because the French peasantry had had enough of being ground to powder over centuries of dictatorial abuse and superstitious priests and so on. And so we knew that we were at this moment when the Enlightenment had come together with the New World and the people who were highly educated in the Roman Republic and in their Plutarch and in their Solon and Demosthenes and Cicero. And so when I wrote the Declaration of Independence, I wasn't really writing it myself. I was just a pen through which the history of human aspiration was flowing. I didn't try to say anything personal. I tried to embody the American sense of the thing in language so rational and firm that it would command dissent, command persuasion. And so we knew this was an important moment, but we didn't know that we would become famous. We knew that the moment was pivotal, but I never thought, that history would look upon me as someone worthy of being carved up on a mountain in the Dakotas, or worthy of being on our currency, or worthy of having a national memorial in Washington, D.C. Those things were not part of my thinking. My thinking was, I am an able writer who has been given an assignment that would have been done by somebody else if I had never been born into the world, but that moment is not just an American moment. It's a world historical moment, and I dare say that even in your own time, several hundred years after the fact, that the 4th of July, 1776, and the document that Congress issued that day is one of the supreme achievements of humanity, and not just Americans, but all of humanity. And it's aspirational in your time for those people on earth who still don't live under due process and a Bill of Rights and a constitutional structure of order. So the fact that I got to be a part of it is humbling. It brings me a sense of the magnitude of the thing. If I'd known how important the document would become historically, I probably would have refused to do it. Yes, because who am I? I'm a well-educated Virginian.
Well, you said earlier, sir.
I'm a good writer.
You are an excellent writer.
That's why I'm
here.
Here.
It's a pleasure to read your words, sir. But you said earlier, those who were kings were no better than the average man. It was a social accident, I believe you said that.
Yes.
They ended up in the positions they were, and then you talked about being on a mountain and a national figure and a national monument and being on currency. And some of that, sir, is reinforcing that social accident, don't you think?
Yes.
Not to minimize things or make them better. When I read the Declaration of Independence, I am not so moved by its particular words, although there is some extremely important prose in here and things that, again, are a pleasure to read. But a lot of it is what we would call a shopping list of complaints. And yet it gives us the basis of the founding of our nation.
Well, if you went to a group of rebels and you didn't know what they were about, but you just assumed that they were terrorists or ruffians or purely selfish beings, and you said to them, justify what you're doing. If your cause is just, you ought to be able to state it.
Let the facts be submitted to a candid world.
Yes. So by outlining the crimes of George III and the Parliament and the ministry, I was saying we didn't seek this revolution. We were just good English citizens. We would not have rebelled because of one incident or another incident, I say in the Declaration, but when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, then and only then do people have a right to rise up and overthrow their government and to institute a new one, which is closer to human aspiration and their own will. And so I was trying to say we've been patient. Finally, it's clear there will be no reform, that this pattern will continue forever unless we stand up for ourselves.
There is some caution in there. I'll quote your words, sir. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes.
So if the British ministry impose the Stamp Act on us, which they did in the 1760s. And we called attention to it, and there were some street protests and some pamphlets and some remonstrations and so on. And they then said, we hear you, we'll try to be more thoughtful in the future. You can absorb that. It's not pleasant, but you can absorb an abuse here and a little bit of corruption there.
When things become too bad, you claim the right to...
There is a right to revolution.
Right, to change the form of government when things get as bad as they seem to be.
In his second treatise on government, John Locke says that we have a social compact. We decide how we wish to be governed. Most governments wind up corrupting that social compact. When the thing gets so distorted that it no longer serves its purpose, the people should come together and to try to adjust it. But if there's somebody who stands between them and that reform, in this case George III, eventually they have to appeal to heaven, by which he meant engage in armed revolution. So we were taking our theory of revolution, that humans have a right to revolution. It's not something you should practice routinely. It's not something you should do for light and transient causes, but people do have an inherent right to revolution. And that means you, as peacefully as possible, you tear down the system that is imposing upon you, and as peacefully as possible, you erect a new system that's more in keeping with your aspirations and human rights. If you can do that this side of violence, so much the better. But unfortunately, blood is the price of human liberty. And I was almost alone among the Founding Fathers in not being afraid to say that. I said the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. That is its natural manure. And people like John Adams and George Washington and Abigail Adams were appalled to hear me talk that way. But of course it's true. You cannot be free in the long run unless you are prepared to take a musket into the public square. I wish that were not the case, but it is.
Mr. Jefferson, when independence was declared, I'm certain that you and your peers looked beyond that act. There must have been visions of what America was to become. You must have been thinking further than the act of independence.
I was a little unusual in this regard. For one thing, I wasn't a warrior, and so the action was fighting the British, and that was George Washington and many, many others. I was not a warrior, so my biggest goal, the minute the Declaration had been adopted, was to get back to Virginia, because I'm a Virginian first and a member of the United States of America only second. And I thought that the future was not winning the revolution, which I assumed we would in the long run. An island can't control a continent. But the future was, what are we going to erect in place of the British colonial system? And so the scene of action, the arena where I wanted to be, was Virginia, and I wanted to help write a new constitution for Virginia. And I wound up not doing that, but I wound up drafting one. And later I was put on a committee to revise the entire law code of Virginia. This took 4 years. It was the hardest intellectual work of my entire life. And in doing so, I was trying to create what you would call the software of a post-revolutionary free society. And so I took that very, very, very seriously. It was more important than the armed rebellion, for which I was not well suited anyway. People like Patrick Henry, however, who helped to touch off the revolution and was a firebrand of an orator. He spoke, as I put it, like Homer, I think. But he had no conception of what a post-revolutionary Virginia would look like. He was bankrupt in his imagination about that. And so fortunately, there were some of us who, John Adams was another one in Massachusetts, who were really interested in what comes next. And here's the thing that we couldn't have anticipated. And it's sad. It's almost tragic. We were unified by the revolution. We had to fight. Delaware plus Georgia plus the Carolinas plus Pennsylvania and so on. We had to unify in order to throw off the tyrant, and we did to a certain degree. What we didn't know then, sir, was that when the revolution was over, after the Treaty of 1783, we would not have a unified vision of what comes next, and we fell out. Politics entered the picture, and there were very different views of what kind of a society we should create, with sort of Hamilton on one end wanting a monarchy and Paine on the other wanting an anarchy, and everything in between. And that moment when we realized that we do not actually agree on what comes next was really the hardest adjustment of my entire life.
We're going to take a short break in just a moment, Mr. Jefferson. Before we do, what advice would you have to Americans during my time on how they should regard this document and this day?
Well, the document they can decide for themselves. I do think the preamble has come to be one of the most important paragraphs in the history of civilization, and so I take genuine satisfaction in having been the author of that. I think what they should do if they really want to have the legacy of the Declaration of Independence is step back and say, how are we doing? How's our economy? How's our class system? How well are we doing on the separation of church and state? What is our place in the world's arena? Is every American treated equally in the machine of the law? Do we have roughly equal economic opportunity in this country? I think you should step back and make a list of the things that are important in a free society, and then grade yourselves every 4th of July and say, well, in that regard, we're doing pretty well, but in this other regard, we need some necessary reforms. But I think that self-catechism is the very essence of a proper 4th of July festival.
Good advice, Mr. President. I thank you for it. We're going to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson, now out of costume and out of character, sitting in the barn on an early summer day.
That's so weird, out of character.
Well, because
you're always in character.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sitting with the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. What will you do? What will you do, sir, on the 4th of July?
I usually keep it sort of low-key. Good 4th of July day for me does not include the typical American big barbecue.
Many beers,
and,
pontoon boats.
I'm not that kind of guy.
Fireworks. You go to see fireworks?
Sure. Got to do that. Even if I'm at home, which a lot of times I'm gardening or getting ready for camping or something, or they have a pretty fair fireworks display, and the orchestra plays up at our state capitol.
At the state capitol in
which
Bismarck.
is walking distance, so I'll do that.
For me, I'm with you. I'm not a jet ski and bratwurst sort of a guy, although I've done it. But I'll tell you what I love. I love going out on the 4th of July. You hope that it's 90 degrees at 2 p.m. and then down to 70 at night. I love to go sit near a river, either the Missouri or the Little Missouri, and find a sandbar, and then lie out on the sandbar for an hour, and you kind of bake. And when you open, does this happen to you? When you open your eyes on a glaring hot summer July day, there's kind of a photovoltaic effect where it's almost like a black and white world for a short time as your eyes adjust, and you're feeling lazy, and you take a dip in the river and maybe read a little. That for me is an ideal 4th of July.
So no responsibilities and no worrying about having all the food ready for the 24 people that are coming over and making sure you have enough ice and all
that. Last trip to the grocery store for more buns, and relish. And
I do cherish the day.
That.
I do cherish the day, and I have to say, without getting too soapy about it, this whole 10-some years of talking to Jefferson has an effect on me. I get so upset with people that don't allow for the reverence of the day. I mean, when I see people that are wearing shirts made out of the American flag, or they have them on the back of their car flying, it just drives me nuts. I mean, let's show a little respect. We should all be grateful for the nation we live in. You can tell I was an Eagle Scout, right?
There is. That's a striking.
I have that side of me.
Striking thing of you to say. Let me take it in a slightly different direction. Recently, and this is nonpartisan, by the way, for the moment, Robert Mueller, the man who did the Mueller report, was for 9 minutes on television saying what basically the last thing he intended to say about his 2-year investigation. And he gave us his results in a kind of careful way. And then he said to people, read the report. Read the report. And I then heard commentators for the next 2 days saying, hey, this is America. No one's reading the report. We don't have the attention span for that. That's not going to happen. And people actually said he's a fossil from a previous age, that only a fool would think the American people are going to sit down and read this thing. And it really wounded me to, I'm sure they're right. I know you read it. It wounded me to think that when you have a national crisis where kind of a lot is at stake, you can't ask even a small percentage of the American people to sit down and to read through something like this that has to be digested in short order on tweet or sound bites. And, so I don't think people would even read the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July.
We've done that on the show before.
We have, but I don't
find
think
it in the
people do.
archives. Yeah,
I used to go around, back.
No, that's I don't want to let
sorry.
that thing just go
Okay.
about people not reading, because I agree with that.
Sad if that's true.
We need to recall the responsibility we have as citizens, and I guess the 4th of July is that's part of it for me. Is we don't just get this for nothing. We have to participate. We have to be responsible. We have to read.
We have to do our homework sometimes. Our country doesn't ask much of us. There's not mandatory conscription. We have to pay taxes. We're expected to vote from time to time. You're expected to do jury duty. That's about it. There's not a huge call on us. And so you think, well, what is the duty of an American citizen? Ideally, citizens would follow legislation and be watchdogs about their tax money and worry about government running out of control. But at some point around the 4th of July, you would hope that every American would say, how are we doing? What's my dream of America, and how close are we? And if I, Ralph Smith or Judy Jones, could change America, how would I change it? What are the areas that need some work? I think that is something you can't require that, but you certainly would like to see that, wouldn't you?
Yes, and we get a little of that from Jefferson this week, and I like that. In the past, when we've had these 4th of July conversations, we sort of delved into what it was like during Jefferson's time, and you've filled in a lot of the gaps. Margaret Bayard Smith,
his kind of platonic girlfriend,
who wrote all of the social
she was the
articles and
leading society woman in Washington during the Jefferson era.
There were 4th of July, Independence Day celebrations
from the beginning,
all over the nation, and there's a lot of written accounts of them, including hers. The White House, when Jefferson was there, the grounds were open. There were
one of his 2 receptions,
barbecues, games, bands.
World's
it was a big
cheese.
deal. Yeah. Do you suppose they brought that out on a 90-degree day?
Probably.
Having lived in Washington, I can't imagine.
Imagine
it would
Washington, D.C.
too
before
long.
air conditioning.
Yeah. Oof. So,
well, they did, and of course, then we always at this time in our annual 4th of July show make fun of John Adams, and then you defend him. But when he said to his wife Abigail, the 2nd of July will always be remembered. Parades and orations and fireworks.
For those new listeners, you better fill them in on that.
Well, he wrote this great letter where he nailed it. He said exactly what the 4th of July would be, our annual observance. He said, fireworks and picnics and solemn orations and public preaching and parades and so on, flag waving. But he said, yes, always, forever, the 2nd of July, because that was the day that Congress actually resolved independence. The 4th was only the day we declared independence, and so he missed it by 2 days. And
I'm trying real hard not to defend Mr. Adams.
Whenever I get here, you say, "Oh, you're being too hard on poor Adams."
Yeah,
but it's you have to admit it's funny because he absolutely nailed what the 4th of July is, but he just missed it by 2 days.
Margaret Bayard Smith wrote, "No village, however sequestered, no citizen, however obscure, forgets the celebration of the anniversary of his country's liberty." She wrote that in 1809.
And those who are now being so hard on Jefferson, the mayor of Indianapolis, now running for president, has said it's time to erase Jefferson from American public buildings.
I missed that.
It's there.
Let's call him up.
And we should talk with him. But he represents a lot. He represents a progressive response. I have great admiration for him. My point is that Jefferson is in danger as a historical figure because of the burden of slavery.
Don't you think we could straighten him out on that?
Sorry?
Don't you think we could straighten him out on that if we had 10 minutes?
I don't know about straightening him out. It would be fun to listen to him and see if his mind is open on this subject. But my point is, let's just say that you decided that Jefferson was a disaster in every possible way. You can't say that the Declaration of Independence is a disaster. You can't say that the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty is a disaster. You can't say that the University of Virginia at Charlottesville is a disaster. You have to put this in perspective. We can say that Jefferson was a very bad man and a highly imperfect human being in some respects, but the author of the Declaration of Independence deserves to be known for the rest of civilization.
And he will be.
And we mustn't get into this point where we can never look at him again because we're so sensitive. I take those issues very, very seriously.
I think it shows a lack of understanding of history and
the whole man theory.
When you try to judge a man by the era in which you live rather than the era in which he lived. And I'm not being an apologist. We've been through that too many times, but you're missing something if you're not understanding history fully. That's my position.
When I think about this, there are books on this subject, David. Ho Chi Minh quoted the Declaration of Independence. Mm-hmm. Elizabeth Cady Stanton paraphrased it for the Seneca Falls Declaration of Rights. Every revolutionary movement since 1776 has invoked the Declaration of Independence. Abraham Lincoln freed slaves partly because he wanted to fulfill the unfulfilled promise of the Declaration of Independence. This document, Alexander Pope said that wit is what oft was thought, but never so well expressed. What oft was thought, but never so well expressed. The Declaration of Independence nails it.
That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. I love that.
How about this? The 35 words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Happy 4th of July, sir. It's now time for this week's Jefferson Watch.
And am I excited? Thank you, David. I write in some haste today because I leave North Dakota tomorrow for Colorado, where in the course of 10 days I will give 2 talks about John Wesley Powell, the one-armed Civil War hero who explored the canyons of the Green and Colorado rivers in 1869. That's what's taking me to Colorado, but here's why I am so excited. The literature of the road has excited me all of my life. I read Jack Kerouac's On the Road when I was 16 or so, and I've read it a dozen times since, including recently in the uncensored draft. He was said to have written it on a typewriter on one continuous sheet of paper. So when I left working at the Jenkinson, North Dakota Press to go to college, the editor gave me a box of continuous paper designed for use in the Associated Press teletype machine. I typed my letters and my college papers on that Kerouacian screed. In college, I read Robert Piercig's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance about philosophy, self-reliance, and a father-son motorcycle trip from St. Paul to Bozeman, Montana. And then came Dr. Hunter S. Thompson's Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas and his embedded reporting in Hell's Angels. And, next, the Lewis and Clark expedition, which historian James Ronda once called America's first-grade road story. Nobody who loves the literature of the road can fail to read 2 of its classics, one ancient and one recent. Homer's Odyssey was created around 750 BCE, though the stories it tells are maybe 1,000 years older than that. It is among my favorite pieces of literature. And John Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie, 1961, the author's last great book and one of his best. All of my life I have longed for the open road. There is a chapter on that subject in my book, Message on the Wind, A Spiritual Odyssey on the Northern Plains. So later this week in Denver, I am renting a camper rig, essentially identical to the one used by Steinbeck and, as Huck Finn put it, striking out for the territories ahead of the rest. Eat your hearts out. I have rented a pickup with a camper rig on the back, like Steinbeck. He named it Rocinante, after Don Quixote's horse. And the only thing I know for sure is that I will wander Colorado and Wyoming. I have a full week. I have deliberately refused to determine my itinerary or even a list of things I'd like to see. As Robert Frost said, way leads on to way, and it is best that we don't really know our destination. All I do know is that I want to leave plenty of time each day to sit at a mountain camp reading with the smell of pine in my nostrils and a fresh fish to fry for supper. I'll stay in lesser state parks, take long walks in the cool of the evening, sip a little wine — Steinbeck would have had it as whiskey — gaze at the stars, and sleep with the windows open. If I could have anything in the world, one rub of the great Aladdin lamp, I would have the opportunity to spend 18 months in a modest rig like the one I am renting, driving America, from sea to shining sea, from Key West to Astoria, and from San Diego to the top of Maine. I would visit most of the national parks in the off-season. I would follow the Lewis and Clark Trail from Pittsburgh to the Pacific. I would try to establish Theodore Roosevelt's footprint in every state, where he spoke and stayed, what conservation properties he established, where he hunted, and how he is commemorated in local memory. I would make You Are There videos, post photo essays, write a daily blog, call in the Jefferson Hour from the road, and work on a book about searching for America in a disillusioned time. I believe I could write a book about America that might make a difference, and meanwhile, I would achieve my most enduring and potent fantasy. I know I beg for gifts on the Jefferson Hour from time to time, so this is a big one. If you want to help me see and perhaps change our world, just send me a good used pickup and a modest new camper rig, and you can live vicariously as I explore the redwoods, cook breakfast at the sources of our great rivers, beginning with Itasca in northern Minnesota, read Thoreau on the banks of Walden Pond, pay pilgrimage to Hemingway in Sun Valley, Idaho, grieve at Wounded Knee in South Dakota, and ask for my free glass of ice water at Wall Drug, or the world's largest ball of twine. Who knows? The trip might be a lovely update of Travels with Charlie. It might equally be National Lampoon's Vacation, of course. It might even be Dante's Inferno. You can never tell. But it is my deepest dream of what it means to be an American. My handlers insisted this summer that I do a little starter journey with a rental rig. They assume that I, like Don Quixote, am in fact insane, and there is no Pancho Sanza to accompany me and rescue me every time. I'll be posting daily ClayJenkinson.com and JeffersonHour.com briefings. You cannot find America in a week, and you certainly cannot find yourself, but you can start. I love America with all my heart. I want America to take a deep breath now and start to stand for all that is right in the world again. It's a sad indicator of the state of American civilization that I have wondered a few times if I should take a gun with me on this journey. But since all I own is a paintball gun, purchased to drive off pheasants who were eating my garden, and I then could not hit them at paintball range, I'm guessing that a baseball bat will have to suffice. I end with the words of our mutual friend Thomas Jefferson, who understand why we must travel alone. A traveler, says I, retired at night to his chamber in an inn, all his effects contained in a single trunk, all his cares circumscribed by the walls of his apartment, unknown to all, unheeded and undisturbed, writes, reads, thinks, sleeps just in the moments when nature and the movements of his body and mind require. Charmed with the tranquility of his little cell, he finds how few are our real wants, how cheap a thing is happiness, how expensive a one is pride. He wonders that a thinking mind can be so subdued by opinion, and that he does not run away from his own crowded house and take refuge in the chamber of an inn. Stay tuned, my friends. If you never hear from me again, it's because, like D.B. Cooper, I have disappeared into the vast wilderness of America or joined a peyote cult in New Mexico. Almost certainly I will return renewed by America, 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 chastened by my own ineptitude, and very glad I signed off on the insurance at the rental agency. The road calls, and I must not duck the summons. I'm Clay Jenkinson. Join me next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public Radio. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any past show for a $12 donation, please call 888 888-2853. Again, that number is 888-828-2853. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.org and on iTunes. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.org. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Music by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes